Hello, thank you for joining me today. If you enjoy my videos, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and leave me a comment. Welcome to Nomad's Land Studios, narrations by Rebecca. From the Short Scary Story subreddit, by Reddit user R.M. Staniforth. 2020. I'm stuck in a time loop watching the world end over and over. I'm stuck in a time loop. Over and over again, I live the same 4 months until the world ends and I die. Then I wake up and live it again. Every time I wake up on November 3rd, 2020. The next 2.5 months are plagued with the escalation of already high partisan tensions, resulting from a heavily contested election. The biased media heavily fuels the tensions. I've lived the same 4 months for over 3 years now, and I still can't tell you who won. The nation erupts on January 20th, as 2 people claim the presidency of the most powerful country in the world. Both sides have half the nation backing them up. Even the military splits. January 20th is the day the war starts. By early February, the Civil War becomes a world war, as every major nation takes sides. For the next month, the deadliest battles in human history erupt all over the globe. The brunt of it all happens right here in my homeland. The first time I died was at the end of February. I'll admit that I chose my side and joined in the war. I was shot in the head. The second time, I thought I could ride the war out, but my apartment building caught fire. I had the choice to burn to death or jump 23 stories to my death. I jumped. The third time I moved elsewhere, still intending to ride the war out. I can't tell you who fires the first nuclear missile, but one hit my city before anyone could flee. I died in the blast. The fourth time, I fled the city beforehand, just to die a far worse death from radioactive fallout. I've tried everything. I've moved to different locations and tried different strategies, just to die another horrible death. I've been blasted to pieces, shot in the head, burned to death, cooked to death by cancerous radiation, murdered by looters, and even was once ravaged by a bear while trying to survive in the wilderness. I've killed myself too, just to wake back up on November 3rd. I'm convinced that my only way out of the time loop is to somehow survive. The furthest I've made it is March 3rd, 2021. I'm not sure if any humans survive much longer than that. I'm making plans for my next survival attempt. This is my warning. I hope you do better at surviving than I do. The Girl in the Mirror, by Cat Lady in Training. The day my father first raised his hand against me was the day I first saw her. Long, pale hair, deep, dark eyes, and a gray dress. She was standing behind me when I looked at the mirror in the bathroom after washing my face. The door behind me was open, and she was standing in the hallway, looking at me with a sorrowful smile. I was surprised. We never had any visitors at home. When I turned around, she was gone. I saw her more often after that, always in a mirror, a small distance away from me. I was scared at first because she only came when I had been crying. I tried avoiding mirrors, but then I would see her in the reflection of a window or some polished surface. Over time, I got used to her. I had tried talking to her, and she seemed to understand me, but she never answered. She became my friend in the darkness. She was the one who listened to me when no one else would. She offered me smiles with sad eyes, and I stopped feeling so alone. As I grew older and my darkness grew, she appeared more often. On particularly bad days, I noticed her appearing 1 or 2 steps closer to me than before. Strangely, that comforted me, as she was the only one who had ever been close to me. But then, I met someone. I fell in love, and I fell hard. It was wonderful at first, and the dark days became less and less. My friend left with them. I missed her, because she had always been there for me, but I felt a strange relief as well. It meant that I was getting better, saner. Then there was the accident. It had been raining. We had been drunk. Suddenly, I was alone again. The next time I saw my reflection, she was back. She stayed with me every day after that. I saw her in every mirror. I talked to her, even put up a mirror in my bedroom to have her with me at all times. I loved her, even as my days grew darker and darker. She got closer to me every day, and I welcomed it. We sat on the bed together, me facing the mirror, and her closely behind me. One day, on a particularly dark day, I knew that we would finally be close enough to touch. I let myself fall into my darkness until I could feel her behind me. I did not dare turn around, afraid to see an empty room behind me and be alone again. But I should have, because when I felt her cold hand sliding up to my neck, I knew that she wasn't my friend. She had been waiting. Emergency Broadcast by the author E.G. Writings.
Do not look into a mirror. Lock your doors. Cover your windows. Do not look into a mirror. Block all doors. Go to a windowless room. Do not look into a mirror.
The ringing and the chanting was deafening. It was like every television and radio on the block had turned on to maximum all at once. It woke Jenny and I up, which made me immediately grab the handgun from the nightstand drawer on the side of my bed. I was about to open the door that connected our bedroom to our living room where the TV was blaring the broadcast when Jenny hushed me and made me listen. The ringing came again, and the broadcast repeated. I leaned forward and locked the bedroom door, beckoning Jenny to follow me into the master closet. Locking that door as well, I slid the safe in front of it, trying to block us in as the instructions had said. We waited, hearing the broadcast ring out again, before finally leaving us in the thickest silence I had ever heard. Noises of different families running around in the apartments around us were the only things that broke the noiseless void in the black of the closet. Just as we breathed a sigh of relief, the broadcast started again, ringing once again across the block, echoing from the streets, this time sounding gritty and distorted. The sudden noise caused Jenny to jump, which caused me to clutch the gun tighter.
This is an emergency alert system broadcast. It is now safe to come out of hiding. The threat has passed. Unlock your doors. Open your windows. Look into your mirrors. Look into your mirrors. Look into your...
This broadcast abruptly ended. No siren, no alarm sound, nothing to alert us if there was any more to be said. Jenny and I sat up for a long time in silence, listening to the noises around us, hearing nothing but our own breath and the blood thumping in our ears. Just as I was about to turn to Jenny and tell her, "I think we're okay," the screaming started. At first, it was distant. A few children here and there crying, as if the fear had overcome them and they had cracked under the pressure. Then a woman. It sounded like it was coming from outside of our apartment, echoing off the city streets. After that scream died, we heard a loud thump above us, as if someone was pounding a door down, followed by a much closer scream. I could hear the man who lived above us say something, the wife sobbing, and then another loud thump, followed by more screaming, and then another round of eerie silence. before the original broadcast alarm siren came on again.
This is an emergency alert system broadcast. The test is now concluded. Thank you for your patience.
Jenny and I exchanged nervous glances in the dark. This time there had been no distortion, no cutoff, no reason to believe it was anything other than what it said it was. In fact, after the broadcast ended, we could hear the soft noise of the Office reruns we had watched before bed. Comforted by this, I moved to pull the safe away from the door when Jenny stopped me, staring into my eyes before shaking her head softly no and pointing down to the bottom of the door frame where I could see the faint glow of some light from outside the room. I swallowed hard, desperately trying to remember whether we had left a light on in our haste to get into the closet, only to realize that we hadn't turned on any lights before entering the closet. What was possibly more disturbing was the movement I saw in the shadows of the light moving into the middle of the doorway, before freezing and remaining unmoving while we held our breath. I could feel Jenny's hand softly touch my shoulder for comfort, as we stared hard at the closet door and the shadow standing in front of it. As I felt her press into my back, there was a loud crash, followed by a car alarm. At the noise, I saw the shadow disappear from the bottom of our door, darting away from it towards our bedroom door and the rest of our apartment. I let out a small sigh of relief as I turned to look at my wife, kissing her gently and whispering that I thought it would be best if we slept inside the closet tonight. Nodding softly, she agreed as she slumped back against one of the closet walls, reaching to her side and grabbing one of the blankets that we kept for when we had guests staying on our couch. Sitting down next to her, I wrapped one arm around her and kept my other arm by my side, my hand firmly grasping the handgun. I couldn't be sure when we fell asleep. All I could be sure of is the sound of our alarms ringing outside the bedroom and light from our bedroom window shining through the bottom of the door. Rising, I kissed the top of Jenny's head and slowly moved the safe, opening the door and peeking out into the brightness of the morning. The Office was still playing in the living room television, and the front door to our apartment had been left wide open. As I walked through the living room, I noticed that the mirror which had once faced the opening to our kitchen was flipped. I closed and locked the door as I peeked my head into the guest restroom, only to find that the mirror above the sink was shattered. I turned, hearing Jenny call out to me that the mirror in our bathroom had also been broken, and that I should come over to her. I walked slowly, surveying the rest of the apartment for any more damage, before entering the bathroom and seeing what she had called me for. Not only had the mirror above our sink been broken, but also the small vanity mirror she had for doing her makeup, as well as the handheld mirror she sometimes used. Though the most striking thing about the room was the small pile of tiny glass chunks that ranged from fingernail size to dime that had been piled up in the sink. I remarked how odd it was, telling her to put shoes on and help me start cleaning up the glass shards when there was a knock at the door. I carefully approached it, only to see the neighbor from across the hallway, Rashad, standing outside through the peephole. I opened our door and chatted briefly with him about the broadcast yesterday and the mirrors in our apartments being broken. I was about to tell him that I had to go help clean up when he asked me if I had heard all the noise from upstairs. Solemnly, I explained what I had heard the previous night and reluctantly agreed with him that we needed to go check on the family that lived there. I walked out of the house with him, meeting up with his roommate at the stairs, who was ready to ascend with us and see what could have happened. The first thing we noticed was that the hallway looked remarkably normal, with nothing thrown around and no doors open. As we approached the door, we were struck by an odd sound from behind it. One of the children was laughing. It caused us to pause and share an uncertain glance before Rashad knocked on the door softly. The father of the family opened it after a few seconds. Rashad called him Roger and went to shake his hand, only to laugh awkwardly as Roger stuck out his left hand and Rashad stuck out his right. We all talked briefly of everything that had happened the previous night, before asking Roger if everything had been all right for their family. He covered his mouth, stroking his mustache as he said everything had been fine apart from the children being scared, and the abrupt noises scaring his wife. We inquired more about the things that happened in his apartment when he mentioned that none of his glass had been shattered. He began hypothesizing about what the cause could be, whether it could be something government, or maybe just robbers seeing an opportunity among the panic, when his youngest daughter came running up to him, calling, "Daddy! Daddy!" and grabbing his leg. No one seemed to pay her any mind, but I couldn't help but notice her staring up at me, at first concerned, then blankly, then flashing me a bright grin. We said our goodbyes and I hurried down the stairs, getting inside and grabbing my wife by the shoulders, telling her to pack her things and that we would be staying with her parents for a while. She attempted to protest, but I urged her to focus on packing and getting everything we would need. Confused, she complied, and did so in silence, until we were in the car and had driven for a bit. When she finally asked me why we were speeding off like we had done something wrong, I asked her if she had cleaned out the sink in our restroom. She said she had and didn't know what that had to do with anything. Her expression grew even more perplexed when I asked her, had there been 64 pieces? Exasperated, she said she didn't count the damn pieces and demanded to know what the hell I was talking about. "Teeth," I whispered. "Those were going to be the teeth." She sat back in silence as she saw how grim my face had gotten. I knew the exact look I had on, as it was the same that had stared back at me from that little girl's smile, not 3 feet away from me. We didn't say a word the rest of the drive to her parents. Once we got there, we explained that something bad had happened, called our landlord, and ended our lease, telling the apartment complex that they could have everything that had been in our apartment, and that we were never coming back. The Blackout Man, from the r/no sleep subreddit. A few years ago, I was running my own company from home, and I took on more work than I could handle. I did graphic design for several companies and a handful of larger corporations, which put me under a lot of pressure to deliver. Long story short, too many deadlines and not enough time for me to rest. I decided I needed a break, or I would certainly suffer a burnout soon enough. Lucky for me, I had quite a bit of money saved up, so I could afford it. I took a couple of months off to clear my head. After a few days of me trying to relax and failing to do so, I realized that I needed to get away from my house. Essentially, I was spending my vacation in an office, feeling guilty I didn't do any work. I decided to get away from the city and spend a few weeks at my family's old summer cabin instead. I packed up my bags and headed out of town early next morning. While driving, I was a bit nervous. Nobody had been to the cabin for at least a year, and there had been a few severe storms during that time, so who knew if the cabin was still standing? Well, in any case, I was about to find out in an hour or so. When I arrived, I was relieved to see that the cabin looked exactly like when we left it last year. So did the shed. The lawn was a bit overgrown, but that was okay. I really needed some physical work after months and months of sitting in front of a screen. Then I would chop some firewood for the grill, stuff my face with steak and sandwiches, and fall asleep. Perfect. Said and done. Sometime later, I was chilling in the hammock I had set up on the porch, satisfied and drowsy. I could feel myself drifting off, so I set the alarm on my phone to make sure I woke up before dark. As far as I know, there hadn't been any animal attacks or anything, but I wanted to be safe anyway. I put the phone on the porch railing and fell asleep only seconds later. I woke up before the alarm could go off, to the sound of rain hitting the metal roof of the porch. I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes and immediately thought of making another sandwich, when I noticed an odd shape, maybe 50 yards away in the woods. There, sticking out of the brush, I saw a gray, almost purple human-looking head staring right at me, completely still. It was too far away to make out any distinct details, but I could definitely see large dark eyes in its almost skull-like head. I don't know how to describe the mouth, or snout, though. Imagine a dog's snout, but make it shorter and wider, more akin to the jaws of a lizard, with no visible nose. It was just so weird-looking. The head looked so human, but at the same time it didn't. I wasn't even sure it was a living thing because it was so still. A drop of rain must have hit its eye or something. because it flinched or twitched. I was freaking out. This was definitely a living thing staring at me. I slowly got out of the hammock, trying not to fall or stumble, as to not give this potentially hostile creature any chance to charge at me. I backed to the door, fumbling with the handle, and as soon as I got it open, I turned and ran inside as fast as I could, slamming the door behind me. I immediately looked out a window and saw that the thing was still there, sitting in the same place. I think it noticed me peeking out the window, moving its head just a little bit, staring at me again. I was freaking out, wondering what the hell that thing was. Surely it was just some sickly animal that had picked up the smell of food, right? Our staring contest continued a minute or two before I drew the curtains. I jumped to the sound of my alarm going off. Crap! My phone was still outside. I thought about it for a moment before I slowly opened the door, thinking that I would be able to grab it and get back inside before that thing could get to the house. My eyes fell on the spot I had last seen the creature, and to my horror, it wasn't there anymore. I immediately regretted my decision and shut the door again, without getting my phone. I was about to look out the window again, when I heard something step onto the porch. My heart was thumping, and I made an effort to hide my heavy breathing, and listened as hard as I could. I heard ropes creaking, then a snap and a heavy thud. This thing had just torn down my hammock. I heard steps approaching the door, and the handle started moving slowly. At that moment I felt sick and wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The thing was carefully trying to open the door and get inside. Then it stopped. The door handle stopped moving, and soon thereafter, I heard the thing stepping away from the door and off the porch. Did it give up? I stood there with my back against the door for several minutes before I even moved an inch. I slowly made my way to the window and drew the curtains. And I will never forget what was waiting for me on the other side of that window. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the largest, emptiest black eyes I have ever seen on any living thing. A pale face riddled with purple veins, and a huge smile lined with abnormally large, dull teeth. I had no idea if I fainted or if some sort of primal part of my consciousness took over, and my brain went into some sort of suppression mode. Because when I woke up the next day, I was in the damned shed, with a bunch of tools propped up against the door. I couldn't remember anything after I saw the face, and I have no idea what happened. After hours of making sure nothing was outside, I ran to the porch, got my phone and my jacket, and ran to the car as fast as I could. On my way home, I think I had a full-blown panic attack, but kept driving because I did not want to stop. I drove straight to my parents' house and broke down crying in front of them, probably scaring the crap out of them. My therapist says that this was me not being able to differentiate between a nightmare and real life due to the high levels of work-related stress at the time. As for me waking up in the shed, most likely stress-induced sleepwalking, according to her. Maybe I had some sort of breakdown and I was in worse shape than I thought, but I don't know about that. Thing is, though, when my dad drove to get my stuff from the cabin, he noticed the hammock rope was indeed snapped, and when he checked the shed, the door was broken in, as if something came back to get me after I already left. I don't know if what I saw was real or not, and quite frankly, I'm not sure I want to know. I have no idea how large it was, what its body looked like, or anything like that. I just remember its head from far away, and its face, the eyes, the veins, the pale color, the mouth. I've come to call it the Blackout Man. I woke up with a horrible taste in my mouth. By Reddit author u/Dr. Decay. This morning when I woke up, my mouth tasted like death. Absolutely horrid. a bubbling cauldron of every bad taste I've ever woken up with. I checked the time, 6:30, an hour before I had to get up. I tried to go back to bed, but that awful, bitter, sour taste in my mouth and throat wouldn't let me, and so I gave in and rolled out of bed, making my way to the bathroom. Brushing my teeth didn't help. I scrubbed my tongue, but it wouldn't go away. I scrubbed, and only when I noticed the blood leaking from my lips did I stop. I had to give up. The taste would go away on its own. I hoped. On my way to work, I bought some gum, hoping the wintergreen flavor would drown out the horrible, bitter taste. It didn't work. The end of my shift was nearing when my ability to speak left me almost entirely. My coworker asked me to borrow my pencil sharpener, and when I tried to reply with a simple, "sure," what instead came out of my mouth sounded more like, "Spit that gum out, it's making it hard to understand you," my coworker chuckled as I handed the sharpener to him. I chuckled too, but kind of uneasily, and spat the wad into the trash can by my desk. It plopped into the bag, followed by a long, thick strand of mucus and blood trailing from my lips. I quickly grabbed a tissue and cleaned myself up before anybody saw. How embarrassing. It was numb by the end of my shift, like that feeling of Novocaine you get when the dentist is drilling your tooth out. I could only communicate with nods and grunts, and while I got some odd looks, I think people just assumed I was grumpy or something. My shift was almost over when suddenly a horrid pain filled my mouth. I fell to the ground, writhing and clutching at my jaw. My coworkers gathered around me in concern. My head and throat were filled with fire, a burning sensation like I had never felt before. But the most disturbing part was the movement I felt inside of my mouth. The legs brushing against the back of my throat and the roof of my mouth, like a tarantula was in there or something. I pushed myself to my feet and bolted for the bathroom, the gurgling screams emerging from my mouth trailing behind me. I planted my hands on the sink and opened my mouth, looking in the mirror, and beheld the horrible, parasitical creature that had replaced my tongue, its bulging eyes and waving legs staring back at me from inside my own mouth. And the only thing that I could think was, I sure hope my insurance covers this. Goodnight, Billy, by Zach. Billy laid wide awake in his bed. He couldn't sleep. It was a Tuesday night, and he had a test the next day. 7th grade wasn't necessarily an important year, but Billy was one of those kids that put way too much effort into school. He had stayed up all night studying, yet still found himself worrying. He tried and tried, but had no success falling asleep. There was just one problem with that. Billy was afraid of the dark. He had been all his life. There were always noises that echoed throughout his house each night. They terrified him. He constantly thought there was something under his bed, a monster coming to get him. This night was no different. He heard shuffling under his bed. He quickly dismissed it as nothing, knowing his fears were irrational. Suddenly, a hand reached up and over his bed, grasping his sheets. The hand was pale, a dead kind of pale. It was dripping with water and was covered in seaweed. Billy shrieked with fright. Just as suddenly as the first, another hand appeared in the bed. This hand was the same as the previous, pale, wet, and covered in seaweed. Except this one was missing a finger. Billy could see the bone and screamed even more. On the opposite side of the bed, another set of hands appeared. Slowly, a head joined each set of hands. The heads of little children. Their eyes were as white as milk. Water was dripping from their mouths. Seaweed draped down over their faces. By now, Billy's eyes were as wide as the Grand Canyon. He was frozen with fear. He watched with horror as more and more children appeared at the side of his bed. Some boys, some girls, all dead. Billy counted how many children he saw. 5, 10, 15. Some of them were missing fingers. Some were missing an entire hand. A few kids even had big chunks missing out of their faces. Billy could see all the way to their teeth. Slowly, they all began crawling towards him. They were slowly whispering, "Flesh, flesh, flesh." Over and over again. They began grabbing at his legs. He was launched out of his paralysis and tried to kick them away, to pull his legs away from them, but their grip was strong. The children got closer and closer. Billy screamed louder and louder. He was the embodiment of panic. They all reached for his face and surrounded him. As they crowded around him, as their hands grasped his face, and as all light began to fade from Billy's vision, he heard them all whisper in unison, "Good night, Billy." Babes in the Wood by Reddit user E.G. Writings. The rain was beating down through the night with dominant force. The officers had nothing to guide them through the trees but their flashlights, and the haunting idea of a young girl left alone in the woods on a cold and rainy night. So they marched on. It had been hours since they received the call from a distraught Mrs. Winthrop, saying something horrible must have happened to her daughter, Wendy. She could offer very little insight about what could have happened or where, and was barely calm enough to tell her story to the dispatcher over the phone. Mrs. Winthrop said she had picked up her children from school and had begun preparing dinner. That had been when Wendy pecked her on the cheek, saying she was going exploring and would be back before supper. Mrs. Winthrop explained this was a regular occurrence because her daughter loved exploring the woods behind their house. She would pack a backpack, grab her trusty blue rain jacket, and head out with a large stick that she would use for walking. Mrs. Winthrop said her daughter had a knack for showing up in the last possible moments before dinner. She would return covered in mud and wearing a big, bright, shiny grin on her face. That's why she was only a bit annoyed when supper time came around and Wendy wasn't home. Thinking she had finally gone out farther than her normal excursion and would need a stern reprimanding, the Winthrops began to eat dinner without Wendy. It wasn't until the sun had begun falling that the anger subsided and was replaced by fear in the Winthrop house. The family would stop eating dinner so that Mr. Winthrop could call for Wendy in the backyard, and Mrs. Winthrop could place an emergency call for her missing daughter. It had taken the officers 5 hours to reach the point of calling off the search for the night. The forest had grown too thick and the rain too powerful to safely continue. When they returned to the police department to prepare a plan for the following day and to request backup from state police and forest rangers, a large group of volunteers greeted them. They were all townspeople ready to help in any way they could. The officers thanked them before receiving 2 anonymous tips that had been called in while they were out. Officer Samuels had left the other officers to talk to the volunteers while he looked over the notes. One read, "Babes in the Wood," while the other simply said, "You didn't look up." Thinking it was some sort of malicious prank, he brushed them off, using them as a coaster for his coffee cup when he rejoined the larger group. It was past 2 in the morning when the officers sent everyone home. They agreed to regroup in 4 hours at the edge of the forest behind the Winthrop house. Officer Samuels was about to throw out his coffee when he rediscovered the notes he had earlier dismissed. Not wanting to leave any stone unturned, he sat down, pondering the information in front of him, before attempting to research the 2 phrases. While the officer could find nothing on the second note about looking up, the first note led him to an old 17th century folk song. The song was used to warn children about wandering off on their own. The story followed 2 children who went out into the forest, only to lose their way and wind up dead, with ravens crying over them. "Poor babes in the wood, poor babes in the wood. Oh, don't you remember those babes in the wood?" Fearing this was a taunt or a sick hint referring to what happened to the Winthrop girl, Samuels called every officer involved with the case, quickly updating and informing them of his discovery. They hit the town and began to try and find anyone who had seen anything suspicious. This proved fruitless regarding the missing girl. The only thing of note they discovered from the previous days was about a man running back and forth from the local church at odd hours, leaving the cops to only hope that the woods would hold all the answers they would need, and that Wendy had stayed safe. The following morning, 30 volunteers showed up to aid the Rangers, K-9 unit, and standard officers with the search and rescue. Breaking up into teams of 10, the men fanned out and entered the woods. Officer Samuels led his group to the point in the forest where the officers searching the previous night had to turn back. Pausing to allow the group to catch their breath, he remembered the notes from the previous day and looked up from the felled tree he had sat on. Roughly 12 feet above the ground was a shiny blue rain jacket, hanging over a branch and stained with a dark color. As Samuels radioed for backup, one of the men in the group climbed up the tree and grabbed the jacket. He brought it down, presenting it to Samuels with a solemn look on his face. As backup arrived to take the jacket back for forensic testing, the group pushed forward into the woods. They hadn't walked far when they found a second clue, this time on the ground. It was a small running shoe with the letter W written on the tag in the heel. This was then followed by a second shoe on the ground, a headband around a branch, and some scraps of cloth. The final clue was a fistful of hair stuck to the trunk of a tree by dried blood. The search party stopped just beyond the last discovery in a small clearing next to a rocky incline that separated a raised part of the forest. Most of the volunteers had begun losing hope and tiring. They chose to sit and rest, while the more experienced forest rangers took the opportunity to climb the steep hill to explore the cave. The rangers had been gone only a few minutes before the radio spoke to all emergency services. From what the rangers could gather, it was bad, and they needed to send forensics and the medical examiner. Disheartened, but not wanting to miss information, the volunteers sat in silence and shock as officers and different team members began to climb to the opening in the hill. Officer Samuels stayed on the ground, directing men and controlling the murmuring within the group of civilians. He moved from the group only once to shake hands with a Mr. Oswald. Oswald was a tall and thin man who hid his age as well as his sadness written clearly on his face. Oswald had not been an original member of the search party, and instead had arrived with the backup officers called by the rangers. He was not one for long walks in the sun, nor was he one for the forest in general. He had come with one purpose, to examine the remains in the cave above him. He climbed slowly, preparing himself to come face to face with a frozen little girl who had passed in her sleep, but was shocked when he entered. The cave was not as small as he initially thought, and easily held the 6 men who had climbed up to it, but this isn't what shocked Oswald. It wasn't the smell, or the piles of bones scattered along the walls, or the gore lying in the center of the cave. Instead, it was the copious amounts of blood everywhere. It pooled around the small pile of viscera in the ground, and was strewn across the walls in seemingly random patterns. As Oswald ventured deeper, he realized that the patterns hadn't been random at all. Instead, the blood had been smeared or painted, creating rough symbols all over the ground, walls, and ceiling. The horror of the situation momentarily left him as he became fascinated by a mark on the wall, and began to approach it. It wasn't until an officer put a hand on his shoulder to redirect him that he even realized what he had done. With a renewed focus on the task at hand, he got to work. Oswald hadn't been in the cave for longer than 10 minutes when a young deputy climbed down and approached Samuels. He informed him of the state of the cave, as well as the examiner's initial diagnosis of the body. Samuels took his hat off and asked the deputy to mind the group of volunteers. Samuels then hung his head as he began back down the path they had created from the edge of the forest. Samuels knew it would take time for the forensics to determine for sure that it was Wendy in the cave. He also knew someone had to prepare to break the news to the family when it was confirmed. He had walked for a few minutes, contemplating everything he had known about the entire investigation so far, and trying to figure out how it all fit together. He was distracted when he remembered the folk tale he had researched the night before. Poor babes in the wood, poor babes in the wood. Oh, don't you remember those babes in the wood? It came to his mind in a sing-song tone that was anything but cheery. It immediately made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He looked around slowly in fear to make sure he was alone with the trees. Despite his attempts to focus on anything but the rhyme, he couldn't stop his heart from beginning to pick up speed, the words seeming to echo through the trees and into his mind. Poor babes in the wood, poor babes in the wood. Oh, don't you remember those babes in the wood? Officer Samuels had not realized he was in the first clearing where the jacket had been found when his fear engulfed him and forced him into a light jog. He was also unaware of the situation back at the cave side, where the volunteers had been dismissed and were being led back out of the forest by the young deputy who had replaced Samuels as the group's caretaker. The group was disheartened and nervous because of the news they received by the cave. They walked in silence until one of the volunteers asked if anyone else heard the sound of static. Pausing to listen, other members of the group did, causing the deputy to turn his radio off in case it had been him causing the sound. The sound of the static didn't go away, and instead got louder as the group walked farther down the path marked by Samuels on his way out. It reached a deafening crescendo as the group entered the clearing where the jacket had been found. They paused, looking around for the source of the noise when a member of the group screamed. Following her gaze, the others looked up in shock and horror as they saw first a crackling radio in a high branch. The radio was followed by the silhouette of a man skewered on the top of a tall tree, like a macabre Christmas tree topper. Some volunteers immediately began running back towards the officers and the cave. Others made a sprint to exit the forest. The deputy stood petrified in fear, reading the name Samuels over and over again off the back of the uniformed body. The officers at the cave heard the screams and met the returning group in haste, trying to calm them all down and understand the situation. The others who had attempted to escape the forest had run in blind terror. They were so focused on their escape that they hardly noticed as members of the group tripped or became separated. Finally able to piece together a story through the sobs and gasps of the returning volunteers, the officers moved to investigate and escort all civilians out of the woods. They walked slowly with guns drawn, listening for but not hearing any of the same static that was heard by the volunteers. Instead, they heard a loud, echoing boom that came from the direction of the town. In town, chaos had erupted as the local church was engulfed in a fireball which brought the steeple crashing down into the sanctuary. Calls rang out from all across town for all emergency services, and firefighters rushed to the scene trying to extinguish the blaze and determine if anyone was hurt. Similarly, the officers in the woods were attempting to find any of the missing volunteers and to make sure none were hurt. This proved harder than they thought, as they were not only unable to find the body of Officer Samuels, but any signs of the missing people at all. They were close to walking out of the forest when they heard moaning and sobbing. Rushing over to the noise, they found a man leaning against a fallen tree. He was whiter than the bone sticking out from his leg and was murmuring incoherently. He began fading out of consciousness as they helped him up to take him out of the forest, saying a few words before hanging his head. It took them. Trees. Fearing the worst, the volunteers who had seen Officer Samuels turned and looked into the canopy. They saw that the trail they had just walked down was shaded with bodies skewered across the tops of trees. The group was petrified with fear as the wind began blowing, shaking the leaves and making shadows dance between the trunks around them. In town, the firefighters were relieved to find there had been no one in the building at the time of the fire. But relief faded quickly as they were puzzled and disturbed to find there had been drums of gasoline placed in the hall between the steeple and sanctuary. Recalling the statements taken the previous day about an individual acting suspiciously around the church, the officers set out to gather information. 2 officers had found a witness who was able to tell them information about their possible suspect. He had been seen driving a green van that had a scrape along the right side from fender to bumper. He was also seen running things in and out of the church while wearing a robe of some sort. The officers knew of only one vehicle in town which matched that description, and set off to the house of Howard E. Jones, a local artist. Jones answered the door nervously, not wanting to let officers into his home or wanting to exit the home himself. Noticing his demeanor, one of the officers attempted to peer into the crack between Jones and the door. His vision was immediately blocked as Jones placed his hand on the door frame, revealing a scabbed cut of a symbol matching the one on the detonators. The officers reacted immediately, grabbing Jones and pushing into the home, or what could loosely be called a home. As one officer fought to put cuffs on the struggling man, the other gazed around a room devoid of any indication that someone lived in it. There was no furniture and no lights except a few scattered candles and the flicker of the fireplace. They got Jones secured and sat him against the wall in his kitchen before breaking apart to search the rest of the house for any evidence of bomb-making materials. One officer found success, as the master bedroom had been littered with wires, timers, and tubs of labeled chemicals. However, the other officer found something far more disturbing and called out that he needed his partner to see what he was seeing. Down a hallway at the opposite end of the house was a room with windows blacked out. This forced the officers to use their flashlight beams to examine the room. The first thing they noticed was that some symbols covered every inch of the floor, walls, and ceiling in spiral patterns, all leading to one point. In the center of the spirals was a wall-length painting of a creature. It was white-gray with vertical slit eyes and blood-red symbols, which matched those in the room and appeared to be oozing blood, trailing from the black toothy smile down its impossibly long arms to its black claws. The officers went deeper into the room, stepping closer to the image when they heard a clatter coming from the kitchen. They rushed towards it, expecting to see Jones escaping the house, but slowed as they noticed he hadn't moved from the room. Instead, they saw a drawer that had been ripped from its rails. Howard E. Jones stood next to it, crying. He was holding a road flare above a tub from his bedroom, which had been labeled Boom. Jones swallowed hard and whispered the words, "Poor babes in the woods," before lighting the flare and bathing himself, the officers, and the entire house in a wave of liquid flames. The sirens echoed in the streets as 2 ambulances passed each other, one empty and rushing to the Jones house, the other coming from the edge of the forest. It had picked up a single man who had been leaning against a squad car, unconscious and holding a badly broken leg. The EMTs worked hard to deal with the bleeding and intubate the man with the weak pulse. They feared he had separated from the search party, injured himself, and hobbled out of the woods, only able to hit the emergency alert button on a CB radio before passing out. He was admitted to the hospital at 3 p.m. on that Tuesday afternoon, missing most of his tongue. He also had a right leg which needed to be amputated mid-calf, and deep scratch marks on the back of his neck and behind his knees. It would be 5 weeks before he woke up. He had missed the largest search and rescue attempt the country had ever seen, as well as the massive wake for the 45 men and women who had entered but never left the forest on that Tuesday morning, and the little girl who had gone missing the night before. Doctors and FBI agents all attempted to gain information by having the man write, but he refused, instead only drawing the same symbol over and over with increasing distress. When the clipboard had been taken from him in an attempt to calm him down, he began scratching the symbol into his thighs. He broke the skin, forcing doctors to sedate him against his protest. The final act of his life would be to scream, a vocal cord ripping scream that sounded unnatural and set everyone in the hospital on edge. As the scream faded, so did the man's consciousness, followed by his heartbeat. The doctors pronounced him dead, claiming his death had been due to cardiac arrest from an allergic reaction to the sedative they used. This was the universally accepted reason. To this day, no bodies have ever been found in that forest, and no one has been able to explain why the man was pointing out of the window and into the trees as he breathed his last breath. By Reddit user HackShuck, The Feckless Girl and the Ghost of the Catacombs. A feckless girl ignored her mum's advice and set off to explore the catacombs beneath the quaint Cornish coastal town of Polperro, catacombs which have claimed many a feckless person's life. Legend tells of many wonderful treasures hidden within, and guarded by the ghosts of the pirates and wreckers who'd plundered this bounty. The best-known story is that of an 18th-century smuggler named Willie Wilcox, who was chased into the caves by the authorities. But he hid too deep and became insane trying to find the exit. He finally collapsed, driven to despair. They found his corpse, cruelly just a few feet from daylight. His anguished cries are said to echo above the sounds of crashing waves nearby. Anyway, one stormy October day, the feckless girl entered the catacombs to seek her fortune. She took only 6 matches, and her tattered clothing, for hers was a hard life since her father had been lost at sea that summer. But she'd not gotten far from the entrance when she realized it had gotten too dark to even see her hand in front of her face, and she couldn't even be sure of which direction she'd come. She lit a match, and someone suddenly blew it out. "Who's there?" asked the girl timidly, but no answer came. She pressed onward, fumbling forwards in the dark, or perhaps going backwards, or around in circles. Sometimes she stumbled or bumped into a wall. Finally, in frustration, she lit another match, and someone suddenly blew it out, though not quite as quickly as before. "Who's there?" inquired the girl, with a little steel in her voice, but no answer came. She carried on. Now her eyes seemed accustomed to the dark. She was able to make her way a little easier. Stalactites fed droplets of water. Their echoes seemed to whisper a warning. She lit another match. There was no doubt this time. It took longer for someone to blow it out. "I said, who's there?" called the girl, emboldened by the seeming shift in power between her and her recalcitrant companion. Her echoes seemed to reply in an ancient language, perhaps the dead tongue of Cornish. "You don't scare me!" bellowed the girl, and again the reply was like gibberish to her ears. She strode forward. Another match was blown out, but again, not quite as fast. Then another match. Again it seemed the ghost was slower to the draw. Then the girl lit her final match, and nobody blew it out. As it burnt down and singed her fingertips, the girl saw she stood in a huge, low chamber, surrounded by 5 or 6 passageways. Suddenly her boldness faltered. She longed for her companion to return, for no person had ever felt so utterly alone. Though, of course, her matches had merely been extinguished by fresh air, now far, far away. Her disappearance in 1926 prompted the local authorities to finally seal off the catacombs for good. By Reddit user R.M. Staniforth. Promise me you'll haunt me. We met at a concert on a gloomy Halloween. I was drawn to her like a maggot to a rotting corpse. I saw her, and she saw me. At first, we didn't even talk. We just jumped and danced to our favorite music. Her black hair bounced in the display of multicolor lights, but her free spirit outshone them all. We spent the rest of the night in the woods, walking and talking until the sun rose. The first time she touched my hand, I was already smitten. She was truly my fallen angel. 1 year later, on Halloween, we walked those same woods under the full moon. On my knees, I presented her a ring, a black diamond cut in the shape of a coffin, sitting on top of a black metal band. "Promise me one thing," she asked, as I slipped the ring over her finger. "Anything, my love. If you die first, promise me you'll haunt me." "I promise, my love." We sold all our things and explored, traveling the world, touring the most haunted locations, exploring the dark and studying the occult. We learned to walk among the living and the dead. Till death do us part wasn't enough. The next Halloween, we stood in Hauska Castle, on top of the portal to hell. She walked down the aisle in her beautiful black dress. We cut our left hands and joined them together. I had only one question. "My love, if you die first, do you promise you'll haunt me?" "I do." We bought an old house in the woods, the one that nobody wanted. It was horrifying to them, but beautiful to us. We lived and we loved, walking our woods among the living and the dead, walking together under every full moon. On Halloween, our anniversary, she looked me in the eyes in the dark of the night. "If you die first, do you promise you'll haunt me?" "I promise, my love." After she fell ill, I carried her through our woods. As I held her in my arms under the full moon, I asked her for the last time, "Do you promise, my love? Do you promise you'll haunt me?" "I do," she whispered in my ear. After her funeral, on a gloomy Halloween, I sat in our woods fearing that I was alone. The touch on my back let me know that I wasn't. She whispered in my ear, "I promise, my love, till death I will haunt you." We walked our woods together as I grew old. As she promised, she stayed by my side. On my last Halloween, my love stood in front of me. She had only one question. "Are you ready to join me?" "I'm ready, my love." We walk our woods together, among the dead and the living, haunting together in our woods for eternity. By Reddit user Ren Writer. Jerold's Wait. Jerold was sitting in the same chair, at the same window, staring outside, waiting. The first snow was falling, and he remembered the time when he'd played out there with the neighborhood kids all those years ago. He remembered it so vividly that afternoon. The sun had been bright, just like today, but its light didn't reach him, not anymore, not up here, in this ghastly room. He didn't even notice the single tear that streamed from one of his eyes, thick, yellow, and almost syrupy. It carved a path down his sunken cheek. The shaking came over him like an avalanche, burying his thoughts. The pain that follows was worse, cutting through him hot and ragged. It lasted for almost a quarter of an hour. The third time since noon, the seventh since he woke this morning. It's gotten so much worse this past year. "You there?" he called out then, as he watched the few lonely snowflakes twirling through the air.
"Of course."
"So, is it finally time?" The voice behind him turned into guttural giggling.
"No, Jerold, you aren't ready yet."
"No, damn it. I've been ready for the past 3 years. I'm ready now. So why don't you just take me already?"
"Were they ready, Jerold?"
He was about to reply, but a terrible, wet cough rattled through his body, shaking every brittle bone in it. "Damn you!" he screamed, but he got no reaction to his outburst. He tried to dig his fingers into the armrest, tried to will himself to get up, but however much he tried, there was nothing. He had no energy left, no muscles to serve him. And so he stayed where he was, in his terrible, lonely prison. Slowly, anger rose inside of him, burning anger, fiery, hotter even than the pain he'd felt mere moments ago. "Why don't you just take me already?" he screamed at the quiet room.
"You know why, Jerold."
A bodiless, grim voice whispered into his ear. "Yes, I know, but I couldn't help it. I tried, but couldn't wait anymore. I just couldn't."
"You murdered them, Jerold. 3 little boys, whose life you cut short that afternoon."
The voice continued. "I know, damn it, I know. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. So take me already. Just please, please let me move on."
"No, Jerold. You'll wait, and you'll continue to wait. For I'm going to let you live in their stead. What time you took from them, I've added to yours."
The voice trailed off, a hint of devilish glee hidden behind its words. "I shouldn't even be alive anymore. The heart attack, the cancer, this rotting body here. There's..." But he broke up, for he knew he was gone again. Once more, the Reaper had abandoned him, and once more he'd left his soul to linger in his own rotten body for yet another year.